go. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best the best arguments and information so that you could stand up and use your voice. Tonight, I'm sitting with Dr. Richard Carrier again. Hi there, Rick. How you doing?
Doing great. Yeah, looking forward to this reaction video.
Well,
I've come prepared. I have my Glenmorangie.
Oh, nice.
I need something smooth for this.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Why don't you explain to the audience what we're doing?
Right. So recently you've taken Dr. Andrew Loke to task with his I guess defending the Kalam Cosmological argument. I have tried to get caught up on the entire debate, but I was really only able to read like one or two of the articles. I do have everything listed in the description if anybody wants to go and go through that. I've also got a link down there that'll take you to the scholarship book list. As well as to there are also links in there to very important videos from the Skydive Phil channel. I know they renamed their channel here recently, but they used to go by Skydive Phil.
Oh, what's the new name?
Oh, it's just Phil whatever it's just his actual name. Phil whatever.
Right. Yeah, I didn't know.
Yeah, but I got both of the links in the description, and they both handle Dr. William Lane Craig, who is sorry, it started playing on my end. But Dr. William Lane Craig is a favorite of Cameron Bertuzzi, that's the channel Capturing Christianity that this appeared on. And so basically they're a little long-winded, so we're gonna try to let them get through it. And I've tried to cut it down as much as I can without removing any kind of context or anything like that. While we're discussing things, I'm going to get the original link added because I just remembered that I forgot to put the original in there, I believe, in the description, that is. But we're talking about the Kalam cosmological argument today. And Dr. Carrier has, holds a position where basically even the first premise of the Kalam fails. And that's the causal principle. Like everything that exists begins to exist. I can't remember exactly
everything. Well, it's worded differently by different proponents, but a common one is everything that begins to exist had a cause of its existence. So there's everything that begins to exist has a cause. Is the first premise. The second premise is that all reality had a beginning. It's often worded worse than that, like the universe had a beginning, which is non-specific as to things prior to the universe. But the gist of the second premise is that that's actually the least interesting premise because it's just wildly false. I should say it's unestablished, right? And it's like every scientist you ask, even the ones that they try to quote mine in support of the second premise, if you ask them, they'll explain like, well, no, I actually don't know that there was a beginning. They could be past eternal, and they have different opinions as to whether it was past eternal or not. But they will tell you that based on current observations, we cannot establish with confidence whether the universe or existence was past eternal. And this is true even for Bourdieu, Guth, and Vilenkin that people often cite. All three of those guys have said this. The Skydive Phil channel you're talking about has the best collection of interviews with these guys and other experts just saying like, look, no, we don't know that for sure. So it's not an established premise. But I find it uninteresting because the science is really clear on that. You can't gainsay it. And I don't think it's an interesting question whether the universe is past eternal or not. I think it's a more interesting question to ask why, regardless whether it was past eternal or began, why is it the way it is, right? So like that's an interesting question. And I think even without theism, naturalists would still be asking that question. And really, it's a question for scientists. That's what cosmological science as a field is about. Also, to an extent, theoretical physics, about the foundations of reality in terms of space-time and matter-energy. Those are frontiers of science, and they're interesting. And so I find it interesting to ask the question, like, well, what if everything began? What would have caused it, or did it have a cause? What does it even mean to ask whether it has a cause, right? I do find these interesting questions, and I'll continue to talk about them, but from a godless, like plausible perspective. I'm not going to do this Kalam bullshit anymore because this has been like, I don't know, maybe the 12th debate I've done on the Kalam, and I'm sick of it. Like, it's the same bullshit over and over again, and I'm tired of it. So this reaction video will be my send off for that. Like no more Kalam, please. I'll still do like teaching. Like, if it comes up and I'm teaching a course, or if someone hires me to consult on it, I'll still deal with that, but I'm not going to publish on it anymore. I'm not going to debate it again. It's just, I just can't stand it. And so maybe we'll get to some of reasons why in this video. I don't know, but yeah. So that is the question of the first premise, is that. Now we should let the audience know that I have not seen this video because I'm especially done with Andrew Loke. Like, he's lied and misrepresented and quote mined me, and when I finally did do an actual debate with him, he just ignored all my arguments and just kept repeating the arguments that I refuted over and over again. And he's done this over massive word walls over and over and over again, and on his blog and stuff. I'm just tired of it. So if anybody has the energy, who cares? You can go, like, I have all the links. You can go and read what I've written, and then go through the links and read what he wrote. And most of what he wrote is like word walls of bullshit that just don't address what I'm talking about. And with straw man, like every possible fallacy that you could think of is in there. The thing that really pissed me off, though, is when, like, in his book, about how he literally like misquotes me in like extremely dishonest ways to produce completely different arguments than I actually made, and then not respond to the actual argument, right? So like, he creates a fake argument I never made, ignores the actual argument. Nowhere in his book does he address it, and then tries to refute the other bullshit argument. So there's other aspects of this where he just makes stuff up. He's wrong on the science. It's just, and this happens over and over again, and I get tired of it, dealing with different philosophers. I have to say, I have to take caution with myself to not throw on to Loke all the weariness that I have from all the other operators who've argued for the Kalam, who've been even shadier than Loke. And so it's just a common theme, right, amongst defenders of the Kalam, that I'm kind of starting to conflate all these guys, and I shouldn't do that. But it is a common theme across them all, like the dishonesty, the delusion, the disconnect from real science, and the way they act indignant when we point this out, right, rather than like changing or evolving or educating themselves or any of this. I'm just done with all of that. Loke is just one instantiation of it. He doesn't do all the dirty deeds that I've encountered Kalam proponents doing, but he does some of them. And well, we'll see where we go from here. And again, point being is, I've not seen this video. I'm not going to watch it. The only reason I'm here is Godless Engineer asked me to come on and respond to some clips. And so I'm like, yeah, all right. I'll bring my Glenmorangie and, and respond to some clips. Yeah.
All right. I do kind of want to start out addressing, bringing up something that not to, I didn't really want to show these kind of clips or anything like that, but there were some, personal things that were said at the very beginning of their interview. This one actually tacks on to what you were just saying about Andrew Loke and his responses to you and how he presents you in his book. He is actually of the opinion, which will not surprise you. This is, I'm quoting from the interview he did at about 6 minutes. He says, I show that he shows by the 60 errors which I have identified in his writings, Carrier doesn't actually understand basic logic and modal logic as well as metaphysics. He doesn't know how to read properly and represent the views of other scholars properly. And so given his failure to do so, it's not surprising that he thought that I said nothing worth replying to.
Yeah, so, he noticed he's throwing back at me the things that I caught him doing. And pointed out. So now he's just like, trying to mirror that back onto me. But anybody who objectively checks, you'll find that I didn't do any of the things that he's claiming. He did all of those things, right? Like, this is Freudian here. Like, it's totally a Freudian defense where he's accusing me of all the things that he actually does. And the only way to tell the difference, like, we're both making the claims, the only way to tell the difference, if you really care, is you have to go and read my writings and then his massive word walls. You have to sort of endure that. To do a comparison to see who's telling the truth here.
Yeah. And then Cameron, at the very beginning of the video, Cameron always likes to throw the whole mythicist thing. Whenever,
as if that matters, right?
Yeah, as if this matters. It kind of came off to me as sort of a poisoning the well, or at least an attempt at it.
This is typical Christian apologetics, right? This is what they do,
Mhm.
is because they don't have a legitimate argument, and because they're not going to address my actual arguments, they have to come up with a bunch of propaganda to try and get people to dismiss anything I say. And of course, what they're going to do, I know they're going to do it because Loke kept doing it over and over again, is misrepresent the things I've said. Those are designed for the same purpose, to get people to think, oh, that's what Richard said. Oh, then why should I read anything he says? Yeah, because they just lied to you and tricked you into not reading what I said. So that's exactly what they're doing. That's the entire design of this project. And that whole poisoning the well tactic, that's a classic approach to sort of basically get people to not read what I actually wrote. And that to me is disingenuous, slimy, and kind of gives it away. Like, if you have a legitimate defensible position, you don't have to do that, right? Like,
Mhm.
only people who have an indefensible position have to resort to those kinds of tactics. And so, yeah, that's the kind of reason, like, I'm not going to read these posts anymore. I'm not going to watch these videos anymore. I'm done with Andrew Loke and all of that. So,
Yeah. One thing that kind of caught me by surprise at the very beginning when Cameron was kind of describing you is that he says this, quote, he also every now and then he'll sort of pontificate on philosophical things like related to apologetics. So like the different arguments for God's existence and fine tuning, and he'll share his thoughts there, meaning your blog, and those topics, even though his PhD was in history.
yeah,
And
history of philosophy, mind you,
right.
so actually is relevant. And I'm published in philosophy. I have multiple peer-reviewed articles in the field of philosophy on diverse subjects. So I'm not just some rando. I actually treat it like my religion. Essentially, it is my philosophy is my religion. So I take it very seriously, and I actually read things, and actually study the sciences and things that relate to these things.
Yeah, and
That's
I
not what I find with my opponents. When I throw at them all the evidence I have and all the scholarly papers and all of that, they don't even read them. They like ignore them. They just blow right past them and just keep repeating the same nonsense.
yeah, and I believe one of your early books was actually I believe it's called Sense and Goodness Without God.
It was actually my first book,
First book, yeah.
which was basically just a sort of a manifesto of where I am in philosophy. What positions do I hold after about, at that point it was over 10 years, about 15 years of research and study, as to what do I believe, like what is my worldview, and obviously that was self-published. It wasn't a peer-reviewed philosophy thing. It was just a question of here's where I am and here's why I'm there, which I think most people should be able to do at some point. So if you want a
Yeah.
model for how to do that, you can look at the book. But since then, like, very little of it has been disputed or overthrown. Like, so some of it I would change, and I write about that. You can look at my typos list for Sense and Goodness on my blog, and then talk about where I've changed philosophically. And so like, mostly in the fuzzier areas like political philosophy, my political philosophy has changed in light of all the evidence and facts that I've learned since I published that book. And then my epistemology since that has become Bayesian, because I was anti-Bayesian, and then someone like finally convinced me that holy shit, Bayesian epistemology is the only way to go. And so that's changed the way I approach things. So there's things that have changed after that book. But since then, I have published peer-reviewed articles and chapters in the subject of philosophy and in the subject that come up in the book too: moral theory, creationism, argument from evil, and design argument. So things like that I've written on.
Yeah, and so this just kind of piles on to the whole throwing the mythicist position out there. It just kind of seemed a
Yeah, which
bit
has nothing to do with
slimy to
cosmology.
me.
Yeah. Right.
Right. Like it
Right.
just seems like he's trying to set you up for
Yeah.
being like sort of and what's that? It's not argument from authority, false authority, like a
Yeah. Yeah.
false
Yeah.
authority in
Oh
the
yeah,
field
that's
or
right,
something.
exactly. Which is it's a version of the poisoning the well idea. Is like,
Hmm.
let's not talk about the ideas. Let's just let's talk about qualifications. And then of course, when I actually beat them on qualifications, then suddenly qualifications don't matter, right?
Hmm.
So like the mythicism case is a good example. Like, notice he couldn't do this the other way around, right? Like, I actually have a PhD in ancient history, so he couldn't make that argument for mythicism, and yet he was, as I understand it from your description, implying that that was also incompetent or whatever, right? So clearly qualifications don't even matter to him, right? They're not relevant. It
Right.
doesn't matter how peer reviewed something is. It doesn't matter what PhD you have. But he's pretending it matters in order to create this well poisoning fallacy.
Right. Now, the clip that we're about to go into is actually about, I guess, Loke's argument for the very first premise of the Kalam, right? The causal principle. And I know that you have an argument against the causal principle just being accepted as like, something that's true. And so I'm just kind of curious if you can kind of give us an overview before we get into Loke's. I guess Loke considers this to be, something that you haven't actually answered yet. And so I just, I know a lot of people probably haven't read your argument. I was just wondering if you could give kind of an overview of your case against the causal principle.
Yeah. Does the clip you're going to show, do you feel that it gives you a good idea of where he's coming from, what his argument is?
So I think so.
Yeah, I don't want to brief it. I don't want to like put words in his mouth. If he's going to represent it, then we can let him represent it when we get to it. But as far as where my take was, now I actually have multiple arguments because I actually follow a disjunctive argument, which is it's either A, B, or C. If A, then this. If B, then this. If C, then this. But amongst those arguments, one of them is the one that I know that really like gets his goat, and he gets really annoyed by it, and that he misrepresents it a lot. But that's the nothing state argument that we'll get to. But in general, the actual argument I made, and which is the primary argument I made in my article that launched the debate, right? So I did this article on my blog. You can find the links, I assume, are below. My point was that his first premise, as worded, is self-contradictory. And he even admitted this in the debate. He didn't admit the contradictory part, but he admitted that he does not believe that the first premise is a logically necessary truth. Okay, so if it is not logically necessary the case, and that is what you have to prove, right? If you want premise one to stand, you have to prove that it is logically necessarily the case that everything that begins to exist had a cause. You have to prove that that's always the case. Now, if they could do that, then premise one would be solid, and we wouldn't need to continue, right? Like say, okay, I agree with the first premise, you proved it. But no one's proved that, right? There's no evidence that it's logically necessarily the case. Now, if it's not, that means it's contingent. If it's not necessary, it's contingent. If it's contingent, then that means there are logically possible conditions in which it is not true. So the premise is false, right? So like you're trying to say like everything that begins to exist has a cause, except for the logically possible things that don't have a cause, right? Like that's not a valid premise. And there's no way around this, right? Like, so you say it's a contingent, you got to treat it like a law of physics or a principle or whatever. Well, what about if it's contingent? What about before it was true? You can't, like, what caused the principle to be true, right? So you can't say that the principle held before the principle existed. So you can't say it is logically necessarily the case that something caused this causal principle. No, before the principle existed, then it was not true by definition that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Yet this principle that everything begins to exist has a cause begins to exist. But it cannot have had a cause, or it didn't have to have a cause, let's put it that way, because the principle can't precede itself, right? It's a logical contradiction. There's no way around this. You just can't get the principle. The only way to get the principle to be valid at all or usable for the premise is to actually prove that it has to be true in all possible conditions. Now then, that's my actual argument, and that's one that Loke ignores completely and never addresses in any of this stuff. He just skips right past it. What I then say, I'll say like, well, okay, given that, let's put our thinking caps on and let's imagine like, what is a condition? I wonder, like, in what condition do you think this principle wouldn't apply? Like when would it not exist? What would that condition look like? Well, I mean, one possible condition is when there's nothing, right? Like if there's nothing, there are no laws or principles. So therefore this principle cannot have existed, right? If there's nothing, then this principle doesn't apply by definition. So that's a good candidate for when this principle wasn't true. And therefore you have to explain how did this principle arise from that state? And then you have to give like an explanation for that. They don't even try. I think cosmological scientists have advanced some really interesting theories that come up with this. I often brought up the Lincoln-Wasser model, which is a really good paper on creation ex nihilo, which is a conceptual paper that dovetails pretty closely with my argument. And they did this independently of me. So we two groups thinking of the same thing independently is a good sign. So I felt somewhat vindicated when I found that paper. And it's a peer-reviewed cosmological paper. And and so the Lincoln-Wasser model is that if you subtract everything, and this is what I did too, it's almost word for word in some cases. If you subtract everything, like what would nothing be, right? Like, so the argument is that Krauss, for example, the universe from nothing, is the book. And then people criticize him for saying, well, but really you start with something. You start with a set of quantum laws and this sort of bubble of false vacuum. And you start from there. And yeah, there's a lot of stuff not there, but it's not completely nothing. It's still something, right? And so they say, well, where did those laws come from? Where did that bubble come from, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, valid question. And so, right, so that's where that comes from. Now, what Lincoln and Wasser did is say, okay, let's subtract everything. Let's get rid of the bubble. Let's subtract space down to zero, time down to zero. Every law of physics, we're going to dial it to zero. Every particle, we're dialing to zero. So everything's zero. And then they analyze and train that, well, if everything's zero, then there's nothing to constrain what will happen, right? So it's unstable because it's just going to randomly collapse through spontaneous symmetry breaking into something else. And then it's just a question of what would be the inevitable outcome. And that's their model. And that's kind of close to what my argument was, is like, if you subtract everything. Now, what Loke will do is, he doesn't like this, right? He really doesn't like it. What he will do is he will misrepresent what my theory is. And this is the same thing that Alvaro did and various others. I've caught them. Kuhn's did it. And I've written about this multiple times. They do it every time. Is that when I say absolutely nothing, I always qualify. And I say, by which I mean the most nothing that could logically ever have existed. So we're not talking about a state of nothing that's logically contradictory, because we know logically contradictory states can never have existed. So what I say is, like, when you have nothing except what logically necessarily follows from that. So some things do exist and some things do operate. Some rules do apply. All the logically necessary rules apply, right? So it's not an absolute nothing in the sense that there's nothing. It's just nothing measurable. There's no space, there's no time, or at least space and time are at zero. So you could say that there's a 0 point of space and time. So you can say, is that something? Does that count as something? And that's what Loke will do, is like, he'll skip and say, well, that still counts as something. Therefore, nothing has to be even less than 0, which, not a negative number, but I mean, like, even more nothing than nothing, which is contradictory. But anyway, my argument was that that's self-contradictory, and so that nothing state can never have existed. So if nothing did exist, or let me put it another way, if they insist that even a 0 point it's a place, but it has 0 length, 0 time, it has no laws of physics, it has no matter, no energy. If they're going to say that that's something, then they're basically saying, and then they're going to say, like, if there's nothing, then nothing will happen. Well, then they're basically saying that nothing is logically impossible. And I agree with them. If they mean that nothing has to be something less than what I'm describing, that state of nothing can never have existed. So we're not worried about that. But if we're saying, like, something had to have always existed, or something started everything, and we say, well, we can explain everything with a nothing particle, like something has 0 length, 0 time, 0 rules, 0 matter, 0 energy. If we can start from that, and everything that we observe results, like, we can show that necessarily it ends up happening to be the case, then we don't need God, right? Like, we've sorted the God problem, right? Now, if you want to call that something, well, it's just semantics. Like, we don't care, right? Like, yeah, sure, call it something. I don't care, right? Like, if you want to call that something, I'm okay with that. But then acknowledge the point that, like, we can explain all observations better even by assuming that that's how things started than with a God. And this is the argument that they will skip. They'll play semantics, word games about what nothing means, etc. And they'll just say, well, you still have to explain how the nothing point it came to exist. You mean, how I have to explain how once we subtract everything and have nothing, you want me to explain why there's nothing? It's like, that doesn't follow. Nothing has to cause a 0 point of space-time to exist. When there's no space and no time, there is a 0 point of space-time. It is a logically necessary truth, right? Like, that is what it means to have 0 space and 0 time. So there is no further state of nothing. You can't get any more nothing than that. Anyway, so the point that we can start with that and explain all observations is a good cosmological theory, right? And it refutes the first premise. Now, there's another semantic game they can play, which is the idea that, well, okay, we're talking about, if you define that point, you can physically work out that it will be unstable and it will spontaneously break into a multiverse. So you can say, well, that's a cause, right? So technically, sure, if you want to call just random spontaneous appearance of stuff, that necessarily results from a given state. If you want to call that a cause, that's semantics again, right? So you say, well, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, if you're allowing even random, unprincipled, random spontaneous generation you're calling even that a cause. Well, again, we don't need God, right? Like you're defining your premise so far out that God is no longer needed, right? Now we can do it with just a 0 point containing nothing. We can explain everything from that. So calling it something and calling that a cause doesn't do anything as far as the argument. It's all semantics. It's semantic shell moving, right? So this is the kind of game playing that Loke will do, especially with the nothing argument. And again, remember, this is just one possibility. I also talk about past eternal models. I also talk about actual more substantive something states. That's another point. Like you can have something that isn't as nothing as I'm talking about. Let's say the first cause is just Krauss's quantum principle. There's just a quantum bubble of space-time. Maybe. I mean, that's just as likely as there being a God, right? Without any other further evidence, right? Like if you're just going to make shit up and say there just was this thing there, no explanation, and you're going to say it had to be there for logically necessary reasons, we can say, well, you could say that about the quantum bubble, Krauss's quantum bubble. It has to be there. I mean, I don't have a proof of that. You don't have a proof of yours, so we're awash, right? So that's the other side of the argument. Those are the kinds of arguments that go in different directions. But when I do bring up the nothing argument, that's where that Loke just freaks out and can't handle it.
Yeah, I've noticed. As we'll see, he totally just I guess he just ignores your actual argument and instead makes he makes up reasons, it seems to me. But I'm gonna let him speak for himself.
And then I can evaluate based on what I've read, because I've read tons of his stuff. So
right. I do want to emphasize to everybody, if you have questions that you want asked, definitely send a super chat. We will be doing question and answer towards the end of the show. So if you would like to ask a question about Rick's idea here about refuting the first premise of the Kalam Cosmological argument, or anything that we say throughout the show, consider doing a super chat, and we will definitely get to your question at the end of the show.
Yeah, and also make note of the links below, because I'm just here shooting the shit, orally speaking off the cuff. The articles I've written are much more carefully worded, because I know the semantic games that they play. And so if you want to read it, like what is my actual argument, not just the sort of half-ass off the cuff thing that I just did. If you want to know, the exact wording is important, because it matters, because there's a lot of word trickery and wordplay that they will engage to try and respond to what I just said in this video. And it's more important to see I'm just summarizing an actual much more serious, more carefully worded argument that is in the papers that are on my blog. So to pursue this argument, and also to read the Lincoln Wasser paper, which I think is a great paper on this subject. And I link to other papers on creation from nothing in the science journals, which it's worth pointing out. The Kalam cosmological argument has never passed peer review in cosmological science, unlike tons of cosmological theories that are even weirder. They can pass peer review, but even the Kalam can't even do it. So that tells you scientists are not impressed with the Kalam cosmological argument.
Well, and I was thinking while you were kind of giving your overview, a practical example of how the first premise of the Kalam fails is something mentioned in one of the Skydive Field videos, and that's radioactive decay. The actual atom that ends up degrading into the daughter element, that is a completely random process with no discernible cause. And so
let me play devil's advocate for Andrew Loke here.
Okay.
I know what he would say, and I would agree with him on this. This gets back to the Krauss argument. Is that's true? I mean, it's true so far as we know. Let's put it that way. We don't know. There could be hidden causes that we can't see. But so far as we know right now, there doesn't appear to be a cause. It appears to be randomized. And it could be fundamentally random. It's possible. But Loke would point out that, notice how it's constrained only to specific atoms, only in specific ways. It follows specific rules. And there's a whole quantum theory of virtual particles and stuff that it's a part of. So what he says, there's a space-time that has properties governed by quantum laws. Those are still ontologically causing the randomness, right? There's still a state of affairs that exists that is producing that randomness and not other random things. So this is another thing that Loke goes on about is like, why aren't rabbits just popping out of everywhere, right? Like this is, why aren't there just rabbits jumping out of my computer and popping out of my hat and my pants all the time? Like, why aren't there random things just happening all the time? Okay, we can explain this. This is the same thing that I just said. It's like, yeah, we live in a principled space-time, rules governed, physical substrate that follows certain physical laws and has certain physical properties and certain physical contents. And those laws and properties constrain what can and cannot happen. Maybe we'll get into this more later, but yeah, where we are now has that. And so you do have to explain why where does that substrate come from? Why does quantum decay happen? Why does it work the way it does and not other ways? Why is it only that and not rabbits, right? It's like all of there's a lot of questions you have to answer. And that's what they're trying to get at cosmologically is like, what caused that state of affairs to exist? So it isn't. So the question is that they still see that as a cause, even though it's random. There still is a cause. You have to have certain atomic masses. You have to have certain neutrons and protons, certain number of them in a certain particular way that causes the spontaneous decay, right? So even though it's random, it still has a cause, right? And that cause can still itself has to be explained. Why does that? Where did that cause come from? Presumably it began, and so what preceded it, etc. And so that's a valid argument. I agree with Andrew Loke on this. I agree with the Kalam proponents on this point. And so that's why I think if you want to get behind things, there does have to be a first thing. Maybe it is the quantum bubble. Maybe that's just a brute fact. It just exists. It's possible it's the first thing and it doesn't have a cause. Or maybe it's less than that. Maybe it's like Lincoln Wasser. And what I've argued is that we go all the way down to zero and we have an actual cosmological spontaneous symmetry breaking argument for why the multiverse would arise, right? So why laws of physics, including the causal principle, would emerge from this acausal first state. So there's a variety of different ways to solve the problem, but they are correct that the problem does need to be solved. And what their argument is that we can't solve it, therefore it God, right? Like that's the common God of the gaps argument. It's like, because we haven't answered this yet, God is the only explanation. And then they have a lot of other bullshit and rigmarole to try and get God to be the only answer. But the fact is that God isn't the only answer. We have tons and tons of answers in the cosmological literature that don't involve a God. And they might not like those, that might annoy them. I can't help with that. But the proposals are there. So we have ideas. And so there's possibilities. So because there's possibilities, we haven't proved God either. So you can't argue to God from this way, right? Like maybe if you come up with a cosmological theory that makes empirical predictions that are distinctive to your God hypothesis and not made by any other non-God hypothesis, you publish it, you make those observations, and you confirm your God theory. Well, that's how a cosmological science theory would work. That's what you have to do. That's what other cosmological scientists are doing, but they're not doing that. They're skipping all the science and pretending that they can jump straight to God as a theory, even though that's the least plausible theory of any that there is. But the question is still worth asking and is still worth exploring philosophically. What are the possibilities, etc. So that quantum acausal argument, I do reject it. That is not a valid argument against the Kalam. And Andrew Loke would say the same thing that I just said about that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that was one thing that I remember from, because I watched both of those documentaries that you sent me today. And that was one thing that they brought up as like not needing a cause, or at least no discernible cause.
In that video, their point is that if you have this instance, then you could maybe start with a first principle, like a first thing, and they disagree on what that first thing could be. Well, they all agree it could be a variety of things, but they all have their own pet projects, their own pet theories. And you can say, well, it could just be a spontaneous decay of a particular field state, an ultra simple beginning field state. Yeah, that could be. Now, that does require you to posit that there was just a certain law of physics that just was there and has no cause, which that's as likely as there being a God, right? Apart from until you start looking at evidence, then the God theory really tanks as a plausible theory. But if you didn't have any other evidence, you just had a list of possibilities. God is on the list, but so are a bunch of other things. And what they're talking about is one of them, like the spontaneous decay argument. And there's a lot of those in the cosmological literature, examples of spontaneous wave collapse causing the universe from virtually nothing. So that's an actual model. Multiple versions of the model are out there. I linked to some of them, some of the papers related to that in some of the articles that are below.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, now let me switch over here. Maybe. There we go. Switch over here to the video. So this is Andrew Loke. He is going to be explaining basically what he calls his modus tollens argument against, or I guess in support of the first premise of the Kalam.
As we all know, if an argument is deductively valid and the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. The conclusion is true, right? This follows from the laws of logic. And the modus tollens argument is deductively valid form. If P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. And so my argument goes like this. If something, say for example, X begins on cause, then some other particular things, such as Y, which began or could begin to exist around us, would also begin on cause. Because if something begins on cause, that means that there'll be no cause, which makes it the case that only X rather than Y begins uncaused. And moreover, the properties of X and the properties of Y, which differentiate between them in the concrete world, this differentiation, they will only be had by X and Y when they have already begun to exist. And therefore, this implies that there will be no difference between X and Y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, given that the circumstance around us is compatible with the beginning of Y. It doesn't prevent the existence of Y. We would expect to see Y also beginning to exist uncaused if X begins uncaused. However, it is not the case that Y begins uncaused. So for example, we don't experience a sudden increasing in strength of electric field around, beginning uncaused around us and killing us. And moreover, we also don't see another universe beginning to exist uncaused and crashing into our universe, for example. Right? We don't see such things happening. And therefore, it is not the case that X begins uncaused. Right? This follows from modus tollens. And so this implies that whatever begins to exist has a cause. In fact, whatever began to exist will depend on the cause, to be the case that it is X rather than Y that begin to exist, right? So this is the modus tollens argument for the causal principle.
I wonder, any thoughts so far there, Rick? Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm sure a lot of the audience are confused already, and I have to warn you, this is kind of the most coherent of Lokism. Like there's, I quote a paragraph in his book that is hair-crawlingly unintelligible compared to like this is really confusing, hard to follow. All his writing is like this. And when I read it at first, when I read the book and then his follow-up article to my article responding to the book, I tried really hard to be charitable to like try and figure out what could he mean that makes sense. And so it is difficult. Reading him is difficult. And if you followed him right there, all the power to you, because that was difficult. So he also dropped some things here that maybe he went into more detail elsewhere in the video. But the first thing he starts with is so the modus tollens. So that's an actual argument form. He's correct. Like modus tollens works the way that he talks about it. It's basically works like a scientific model where you say, well, if the hypothesis is true, it predicts these observations, A, B, and C. He says Y. It predicts Y. So if X is true, it predicts Y. But you say, if this hypothesis is true, it predicts certain things. And if we go and look and those things aren't there, then X has to be false, right? Now, he's confusing a bit between inductive and deductive logic. And because they're obviously, as science has learned, it is possible for the hypothesis still to be true because maybe you got something wrong about the hypothesis. Maybe there's something wrong with your instruments, and so on, right? There's a variety of ways that the tollens can fail that are inductively related. So, but here he's talking about like,
would you mind if I
what? Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no. Sorry. It accidentally
started again. Okay, yeah. So anyway, but it's fair enough. We can say that strictly speaking, if we set aside all contingencies like instrument failure and hypothesis adjustment and all of that stuff, strictly speaking, if a hypothesis predicts Y should appear all the time and we don't see it, then X is false. And inductively, that's a reasonable argument. Even probabilistically, you can make a Bayesian argument, etc. So we'll follow him along there. So I agree if that's the case. If a hypothesis makes a prediction and the prediction doesn't carry through, that is evidence against the hypothesis. So fair enough. Okay, so then his argument proceeds to, well, if the causal principle was ever not true, then even now we should constantly see random things popping into existence everywhere, right? So we should see random rabbits. We should see like Beethoven's Death Star should suddenly appear. Like, I don't remember the exact examples he gave, but it's the same. We should see these whole houses should be materializing, planets and stars, everything should be like spontaneously occurring right now. Well, this is not a prediction of the hypothesis, right? So like, yeah, before the causal principle applied, the causal principle didn't apply. But once it gets caused to exist, then it applies, right? So like that counter predicts why, right? Like you're saying, like now we're living in we can't see nothing now because we're 14 billion years away from it. Like it's 14 billion years ago or more if it's multiple universes before that. So we're nowhere near nothing. We can't observe it. We are in a principled propertied space-time, right? So we're in an ordered space-time that is controlling what can and cannot happen. So yes, the causal principle applies now. We do not expect to see random rabbits and all of this stuff because we live now in an ordered space-time. But the whole point is, like, if the principle didn't apply before it applied, which logically it won't have done, right? Because it can't exist before itself. In that point, in that regime, in that epoch, in that time of existence, then yeah, your rabbits should be popping into existence, etc. I talk about the probabilities of all of these things, of tigers and rabbits and universes and all of that stuff. Yeah, back then we should observe that, but we don't live there. We can't see back then, right? We don't have telescopes that can. We don't have time travel. We can't do any of this. All we can observe is what happens in an ordered space-time, and an ordered space-time has a causal laws, right? It's driven by causal laws. We can actually even infer those causal laws as emergent from ultimate randomness. I have a different article I didn't put in the links that I gave you, which is linked, I think, in one of them, but it's about how all the laws of thermodynamics are inevitable. But set that aside. Loke never goes there, so we don't need to worry about it. The point being is that his argument is bollocks, right? Like he's saying like that even though the causal principle, we all agree, he and I agree, the causal principle now applies everywhere we can look because it's an ordered space-time. Therefore, but they should still be random things appearing everywhere. It's like, no, that's not a prediction of the theory. That doesn't make any sense, right? Like, yeah, sure, it would make sense 14 billion years ago or 100 billion years ago or whatever it was. Yeah, it might have made sense back then, but we're not there. We're not observing it. So the modus tollens doesn't even apply, right? It's complete bollocks. Like the prediction, the Y is not predicted by X. And that's where he goes wrong. And he throws some other things. He mentions some other things that he goes into more detail. And I talk about in the articles, like we should see universes crashing into each other everywhere. And it's like, that's not a prediction of the model at all. Like, it doesn't follow at all. I don't know where you're getting this. It doesn't make any sense. You're not doing any math to calculate like how many universes, how big are these universes? Why are they colliding with our universe? Like, it doesn't predict any of this. It's complete bollocks. And it's frustrating. And I tried to explain this really hard. I tried to explain this in the debate, and he would just ignore everything I said and just keep repeating the arguments over and over again as if I didn't say anything. And that's why I'm tired of dealing with Loke. But anyway, that's what's going on here. I think there are a few more points. He has 4 arguments. I don't know if he mentioned 2 here. One was the universes be colliding into each other. We'd see a whole bunch of collisions. And then the other is that we should see random rabbits and planets and stuff appearing everywhere. Or he mentioned here the strength of the magnetic field should just change randomly. It's like, no, that doesn't follow at all. That's so yeah, it's frustrating. Anyway, so he had other ones. I can't remember what the other 2 are, but they're addressed on my articles. He might get to them later in the video. I don't know if your other clips show it, but that's his argument. Well, so that's, you see the problem I'm having here.
Well, yeah, no, I trust me. And I mean, he's actually going to address this a little bit later because he feels like you just simply don't understand the words that he's saying.
Yeah.
And that you've misrepresented what
let's give him a shot.
Said.
Let's give him a shot to explain that.
Ask you a question on this. So there's the version of this argument that I've read in Necessary Existence that was co-authored by Josh Rasmussen and Alexander Pruss. They've got an argument. I think they call it the argument from chaos. I can't remember the exact name. That may be actually the exact name that they use. But basically, the argument that they use is that suppose that something can begin to exist uncaused. Now, the question would be, what sort of amount of things could fit into that category? So there's a category column, things that can begin to exist uncaused. Okay, that category, either like if you think that something can begin uncaused, you got to believe that there's at least one thing that can fit into that category. But then the question would be, how many things would actually be in that category? And there's not really a reason to limit it. There's no reason to think that only one thing could exist uncaused. So you'd probably have to believe that that set of things that can begin to exist uncaused is like infinitely large. And then the next step in their argument is to say, if that set of things is infinitely large, then we would actually expect to find things popping into existence uncaused out of nothing all the time, because that set is so large, and there's, you know, it doesn't discriminate of like different times of when it comes into existence or anything like that. So that's maybe I don't get all the details right there, but that's sort of a summary. Seems like it's actually pretty consistent with what you argue here in your modus tollens argument. I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yes, yeah.
So what do you think of this?
Much better stated. Say, let's have a much more easy to listen to and understand person trying to steelman what he said. That is essentially what Loke is saying. Yeah. The problem though is that the condition, the prediction, only holds when the condition does not apply, and where the condition does not apply. Right. So you say, like, where there is not oxygen, you do not expect to see fire, right? Obviously, I know there's chemical exceptions to this, but let's just say standard oxidizing fire. No oxygen, no fire. And then you come around and say, well, that can't be, because then you would see fire everywhere, even where there's not oxygen. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. No, obviously, when there's oxygen, you'll see fire. Yes, but when there's not, you won't. And now imagine it's a universe where there is no place we can go to not observe oxygen. Oxygen is just everywhere, right? Then you can't say we should see it everywhere. We shouldn't expect to see it at all, because we can't find the place that lacks oxygen to observe what would happen there, right? And so that's what they're not getting, right? Is this idea that, yeah, now here where we are, there's a principled ordered space-time that limits what can happen, and limits it in specific ways, like quantum mechanics, even spontaneous quantum mechanics and stuff is limited in very specific ways. Only certain kinds of things can be here and happen here, and so on. But that's here, right? Where we are now. The question is where did that come from? What existed before that, right? And you can't say that the causal principle existed before that, or certainly can't existed before itself. So there had to have been a time when the causal principle hadn't come to exist yet. And at that time, yeah, you'd see all kinds of this stuff popping into existence. But the reason we don't see it is we don't live there, right? Like, that's so far in the past. It's beyond the wall of the Big Bang singularity. We can't see that. So obviously, that's why we don't see things. So the argument from chaos makes no sense as an argument for the first premise, for the first premise of the Kalam. And this is the thing that Loke never understood, even though I explained it to him and I reworded it multiple different ways, multiple different times. I just couldn't get him to see it. He just ignores it. And notice that's what he's doing now. He literally just blown past everything I just said and just literally repeats the argument I refuted. And that's it. Like, he doesn't explain what my refutation was. He doesn't respond to the refutation. He hasn't updated his presentation to be immune to my critique. He's done literally nothing. He's just literally repeating himself over and over and over again. And, you know, engaging with someone like that, you get tired of it after a while. Like, you can't expend any more resources on it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it seems like it's this weird thing, because it seems like, from what I've seen in this interview, that Loke understands what you're saying. He's just totally choosing not to acknowledge what you're saying. Like, he later on in the interview, he actually says, well, this is what Carrier says. And I'm like, well, from what I've read, yeah, Loke is pretty, steelman-y about it. He just totally ignores the fact that you've said anything, and then continues on with because of, my modus tollens thing, blah, 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 blah. And he keeps on going from there, and he just totally ignores your entire argument.
Yeah. It's frustrating. Like, imagine having done that. I've gone through this 3 times now. Well, this makes 4. It's tiring. Yeah. But I don't know what to say. Like, I've tried the hardest I can to steelman what he's saying. And it's just no way to make sense of it.
Right. No, I totally agree. There's a little bit left in this particular clip. I think they're going to interact a little bit more on his initial argument, I guess, for the causal principle right here.
Yeah, the argument is pretty similar to mine. But I read the argument quite a while ago, so I can't remember the details now. And I am not actually prepared to discuss the argument today. But if I remember correctly, I think the argument is based on certain idea of whether something can begin to exist uncaused, and if something can begin to exist uncaused, other things would can also begin to exist uncaused. Now, however, my argument,
right
the way
there.
I formulate it is
Pause right there. That's okay. Yeah. So when he says when things can begin uncaused, we should observe things beginning uncaused. Notice when things, right? Like if, so he says like if things can begin uncaused, as if he's ignoring time location, right? Like this, but no one's saying that it's always the case in every possible location. They're saying like there was a time once. It's not around here. We can't see it with any telescope. It's a long freaking time ago. There's a massive firewall between us and it. Long time ago, things could arise uncaused until something did arise that was governed by a causal law that resulted in evolution of the cosmos into, humans and planets, stars, planets, humans, the whole cosmological story, which you need a causal law for that to happen. So like in complete chaos worlds, like worlds that aren't governed by a causal principle, none of that stuff can stack and develop over time, and thus you will never have observers in those worlds. You need stability, and you need causal stability in order for stars to form and stick around, planets to form, elements to form and stick around, and you need all of this stuff to stack over a long period of time to lead up to animals, plants, animals, and life, and all that. So we will only ever observe ourselves in a world governed by causal principles. That does not mean that the world governed by causal principles was itself governed by a causal principle externally, right? Like it could have arisen spontaneously without causal principle and then be governed by a causal principle, right? So like when you rephrase it, like if anything can begin uncaused, if you rephrase it as when anything can begin uncaused, then you realize the flaw, right? Like he's skipping over the location part of this. It's like, we're not saying anything can begin uncaused anytime, anywhere. We're saying that before the causal principle existed, things would begin uncaused, which is a logically necessary truth, because before the causal principle came to exist, obviously the causal principle did not exist, right? Like it's a logically necessary truth. And he would never get his mind around this. But that's the key. When he phrased it right there, you just notice switch between if and when, and you discover the mistake he's making. He's ignoring time. He's ignoring location. It's as if he can't get his mind out of the idea that if something can be true in principle, that it must be true everywhere all the time. And that's also illogical, right? We know we can prove that. We can disprove that just from cosmological science already, that the laws of physics have changed and the properties of the universe have changed over time. So like, so if you say like, well, if the Big Bang was true, then we'd all be melted at 1 billion degrees Kelvin right now. And it's like, no. Yes, back then, if you were alive back at the Big Bang, you'd be melted by 1 billion kelvins. But it's cooled down since then, so it's not 1 million kelvins anymore. Stop claiming that we're predicting that it's going to be 1 million kelvins now. It's not what we're saying. Anyway, so that's trying my best to try and explain this as if I really need to. I feel frustrated, almost gaslighted. Like, do I really need to be saying this? You know what I mean? Like, I feel like I'm over-explaining this because I've been gaslighted on it by him so much now. I don't know.
I believe me, I definitely understand that feeling. But it definitely seems there's some stuff that he says later that definitely makes it seem like he's very much stuck in some kind of state, as far as his argument goes, where something concrete exists and he never moves past that. And he specifically uses the word concrete when he refers to whatever's always existed.
Is that in a clip coming up?
I believe so.
Okay.
I believe I've got that captured in a clip. There's a little bit more here after he's been talking about his idea compared to the chaos theory idea. So
yeah,
it's not based on what can or cannot happen, but what would happen. I'm saying that if something did begin uncaused, then other things would begin to exist uncaused around us. The way I formulate it actually makes it resistant to some other objections which has been raised against that if you are arguing from can or could, the objections that have been raised by Almeida and others, which I discuss in my book. Yes.
Yeah, I think their argument is compatible with the sense that you use it here, where they're just saying it's almost like a stipulating if that set is not empty, then it would be infinite, and so that would be the sort of conditional premise that they would defend. And then from there, the argument can kind of go through. And so then they would just argue, that the antecedent there is false. The category is empty, because they're if it wasn't empty, then there would be things popping into existence all the time, but that doesn't happen. So
pause it there. Much better articulated, but notice he's confusing if with when. Right. So the interesting thing is I agree with this, because this is what my nothing argument actually is. Right. My argument is, if nothing limits what can exist, like before laws of physics existed to limit what could exist, before there's a causal law, for example, if nothing exists at that point, then literally anything can exist. And in fact, it's an equal probability that anything can exist. And you can show through a similar argument that he just articulated, the chaos theory argument, that infinite things should appear. And that is my argument. And therefore, you will have an infinite multiverse. It is an inevitable outcome of a nothing condition. And I go into more detail as to how that follows, et cetera, and how you define a nothing condition and all of that stuff. It's in my papers that I link to, that you have linked to there. So I agree with them. But of course, this means that all of this spontaneous infinite creation happened outside our view, right? It happened prior to the Big Bang. And these universes exist elsewhere. They're not connected to ours in any way. That's why they can't collide with our universes. They're separate. They live elsewhere, right? Like our universe is just one of the outcomes of this. And it is inevitable statistically. So this defeats the fine-tuning argument as well, because if infinite things can uprise uncaused, then, and they will, then our universe is inevitably going to be one of them, or something close enough to our universe structurally to produce observers, right? So, and Loke agreed with this in our debate. And he said, yeah, I think like, if that's true, there would be an infinite multiverse. He said almost those exact words. And I said, yeah, that's my argument. He says, but then why don't we see it? And it's like, I've explained this multiple times. You can't see it. It's on the other side of a Big Bang. It's over. It's way, way far away. It's beyond our ability to see. That's why. So anyway, that's the difference here. And it's both of them are confusing if and when, right? There's one, if things can begin uncaused. Well, no, you need to be saying when things can begin uncaused. Once you slip out of the if and back into when, then you start to see what's going wrong with their argument and why it doesn't hold as complete bollocks. Anyway, yeah.
I was just gonna say, it seemed like what Cameron was actually stating about the chaos theory, the proponents of that, is that they suggest that because we don't see things randomly pop into existence now, therefore that infinite set that he was talking about has never existed.
Right. I mean, the argument is that basically they're saying if there was no causal principle, then they deduce infinite things should just randomly appear, which is true. You can ramify that in a more careful way, but it is, I mean, we're being colloquial here, so are they. But there is a really more technical way to word this where it is true. So yeah, if that's the case, then that results. And what they're saying is like, well, we don't observe it now, therefore it has to be false. And that's true if it were true that principle applied now, and it doesn't. And that's why it's not true, right? The prediction doesn't follow from the premise, because the premise is that this condition doesn't exist anymore. It existed once upon a time, but doesn't exist anymore. We only see the aftermath of it. We can't see the rest of it. And so that's where they're going wrong. And it's just that confusion between if and when.
Yeah. Okay. So next clip that we have here is the Loke has an issue with nothing. And that's what I've titled this section, is that he starts going through your blog just with Cameron. So I've had to cut out a whole lot of dead air, but he starts going through it, and he really seems to, at least in this section, have a problem with the concept of nothing. And so we're going to listen to him try to fumble his way around that.
I will start from the section where he provides a summary of a debate. So he claims that the debate was a rout. Loke completely failed to defend his central proposition that if the causal principle had ever failed to operate, then we should still observe its failure to operate now. I demonstrated the opposite is the case. It will fail to operate only when no entity exists to manifest it, and we are not in that condition anymore. Carrier's view is that there was nothing initially, right? There was absence of anything initially. And so not even the causal principle was there operating at the beginning. And so given that there was nothing, right? No causal principle, nothing, a multiverse, infinite multiverse will begin to exist from nothing because there's no causal principle operating that prevent that from happening. And so that essentially, right, is Carrier's view, right? That's what he's trying to argue for. What Carrier...
Now, would you agree that's a steel man of your position?
Yeah. No, it's good. It's just the semantics of what he thinks those words mean. But we'll probably get to that. But as worded, assuming you don't do any shenanigans with the words, yeah, that's a rough estimate, a rough description of my position.
Okay.
Stated is a misrepresentation, right? Because I did not say that if the causal principle had ever failed to operate, right, then we should still observe its failure to operate. No, I never used the idea of failing to operate, right? That is what Carrier put into my mouth, right? But I didn't put it in that way.
So I'm wondering what your thoughts are right there, because I've got...
We just saw him put it that way, but maybe not in those exact words, but that's what he said. But anyway, yeah, hopefully he says more about that, because I'm not sure what he could think he means, if he means to say that we should be observing things now, but then just now said that he didn't say that. So,
yeah.
Andrew, you got to pick a lane there.
Yeah, so I've cut in here a section from Future on that's kind of sort of out there, but this is a section further on in the conversation where I feel like he says what he says that he didn't say, but he just blatantly kind of says it right here.
The truth of my view, the conclusion that something does not come from nothing, is demonstrated by my Buddha's tollens arguments, right? So what I'm saying is that, on the contrary, if something does come from nothing, as Carrier postulates, then we would see other things coming from nothing around us as well, right? But that's not the case, right? So I'm going to explain later on that Carrier has not, in fact, rebutted my modus tollens argument at all, right? He is just assuming that in order for a causal principle to work, it has to be, there must already be something, the causal principle must be operating, right? In that sense, that is his assumption, which I have already argued. No, that assumption is not warranted. Rather,
I couldn't follow him there. Like, he seemed to be contradicting himself multiple times. I feel like the Chappelle show. You know the clip.
Yeah.
Cocaine is a hell of a drug. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
So
it kind of seemed to me like I was trying to follow him, and it seemed to me like he was just basically reiterating, like, well, we can't prove that the causal principle has to like be active in order for this thing to happen, since we don't see this thing happening now, therefore it never happened in the past, which seems to be exactly what you described him as saying, right?
Yeah, exactly. And remember, in the clip you showed at the beginning, he gave as an example, which he gives in the book, that if I was right, then the strength of the magnetic field should just be randomly changing all the time. Like, this, nothing controls it; it just randomly changes. There's a whole section on this. He mentioned it again in the clip. You saw him in the clip. Everybody here saw that. It's like, oh yeah, the magnetic field would just be changing. The strength of the magnetic field would just be changing all the time. And it's like, yeah, that's exactly the stupid thing that I'm accusing you of saying, Andrew. And you say it over and over again. And then here, like you said, he says, well, I don't say that. And then he immediately says it again. So I don't know what to do with this. Like, I really don't. It's bizarre. And I should point out also, he gives 4 evidences. And so sometimes I think maybe either the audience or Andrew could get confused. So like one of the evidences is this XY argument, right? Is that there's, which is the spontaneous, the magnetic field could be changing. Things should be popping in and out of existence all the time. We should be seeing this all the time. That's the first argument. The one of the other 4 arguments is the universes. We should see universes colliding with each other all the time. And there were 2 others. I don't remember offhand what they were, but so he has a list of evidences, and he mentioned 2 of them at the top of the clip that you showed earlier, and they all concur with what I'm describing. And so I don't know how he can deny that that's what he's saying. And obviously those examples are refuted by my point, right? It's like, no, we should not see the magnetic field strength changing all the time. It's fixed by the ordered space-time we live in now. I mean, there was a time before the Big Bang when the magnetic strength of the magnetic field could just be randomly anything. I agree. We don't live there, Andrew. We're not there. We can't see that state of the universe. That's why it's a hypothesis. It's a theory. We haven't proven it yet, etc. But this is all theoretical anyway. We're talking about what's possible and impossible, not what we've proven scientifically. Obviously, we don't have that answer yet. We don't know what preceded the Big Bang. There's lots of theories, and they all make a lot of sense. And so none of them have God in them, but just to point that out. But anyway, so I don't want to belabor the point, but that's the impression I'm getting.
Well,
so far.
it kind of seemed like he was saying that he denies the idea that the causal principle has to be in effect in order for causes to exist, or for causes to be required for things to come into existence.
Right. And so, but that's the same thing as saying that, yeah, for spontaneous things. So that's the same thing that I'm saying, right? It's just worded differently. That's why I don't, that's why it was confusing. That's why I'm confused by what he just said. I hope he articulates, but that's all I can say.
Okay.
I said was, if something X began uncaused, then Y, which began to, or could begin to exist around us, would also begin to exist uncaused. That's how I put it. So I think it is false to think in terms of operating or governed by causal principle, a term that he used, as we will see later on. So he seems to think about of the causal principle as something that is governing, right, how things operate or operating in a way, right? But I think it is false to think in these terms. Why? Because on my view, I think the principle is merely a way of describing the fact that in our actual world, things happen one way rather than the other as the result of concrete entities and their properties. So this means that I think it's the concrete entity. This is the concrete entity.
Yes. That's why. It's funny. This is the word game about, well, it's not a principle. It's just a rule. No, it's not a rule. It's a law. No, it's not a law of physics. It's just a description of what happens. That's what a law of physics is.
Well, it kind of seems
concrete entities result in a particular observation. That's a law of physics. That's a principle. That's a law. The semantics are just really frustrating.
It kind of seems
like the causal law. If he doesn't like the word law, now he's distancing himself from principle, even though he loved that word in the book. He doesn't like the word law. He doesn't like the word principle. It's the causal something or other, the causal ishness is the product of concrete entities. That's what he said. And that's what I'm saying. It's like, yeah, there's concrete entities here producing that observation. So we should not expect to observe violations of that, right? Like the opposite of what he's saying. He's saying that, well, if the causal principle didn't apply, and it's, well, if the causal ishness wasn't around, then we would see spontaneous things. It's like, yes, we would, but the causal principle is around now. So you're describing the state of affairs before the Big Bang. Sure, that's my point. But he tries to like weasel out of this with weird semantics about what is a principle and what is a law, what does governing mean, and then just tries to reword it in some other way that's just a synonym of what those other things are.
Well, he seems to both Cameron and Loke seem to characterize your wording of it, or at least your idea, as if you consider the causal principle to be sort of sentient in some kind of way, like it has some kind of control over things, right? Like that seems to be where they're going. You might pick up
weird.
on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird. I mean, that would be interesting. That'd be an interesting response, and then I would have a different response to that. That isn't what Loke has ever argued before. But that isn't what I'm saying. I'm saying what he's saying, that there are concrete entities that result in a state of affairs. One of those states of affairs is what Andrew Loke himself has described as the causal principle. And, you know, like trying to like weasel out of this by changing the word principle to something else, doesn't get you out of the argument. You can't change what things are by changing what you call them. This is the fundamental rule in philosophy. But that's what he seems to be trying to do. He seems to be trying to escape my point with some sort of bullshit semantic argument that doesn't go anywhere, right? It has nothing to do with what we're supposed to be arguing about. And that, I don't get it. I don't get it either, but I didn't see the whole video. So maybe they were getting into that sentient thing more in other clips.
Well, I think they will, especially when they start talking about contingency, because I bet you didn't know, but you don't actually understand what contingency means.
Nice. Yeah.
I mean, Rick, you can't even understand words. So I mean, totally refuted.
Yeah, I'm the one who can't understand words. Okay, yeah, right. Yeah. All right. What's next?
Yeah, they continue on this for just a little bit longer. I can't remember what's at the end here, so I'm just going to let it play for just a little bit.
That is doing the metaphysical work. And the causal principle is not a concrete entity, right? It's not something concrete there controlling anything. You can think of it as an abstract principle that describes how things that whatever begin to exist has a cause. On my view, it is the concrete entities which are doing the metaphysical work, which means that without concrete causes, to do the work of making things happen, there will not be anything that will begin to exist. And therefore, in our actual world, something does not come from nothing. This is not because there is a causal principle governing nothingness or operating. Rather, it is because, including the absence of concrete causes, indeed the absence of any.
What?
No, keep going. I paused.
Okay. Okay.
Potential to bring about something. There'll be no potential for something to begin to exist.
Something else there that has the capability of producing it. Because if you don't have that, then you literally just have nothing. It's not like you have these laws that just like come into existence or pop out of existence, or it's almost like those are just kind of sort of these magical principles that pop into and out of existence. Whereas your view, it's almost to me, it's almost like it's more grounded in reality. Like you've got to have something there.
Yeah.
In our case as theists, we think that God is a metaphysically necessary being, and so he's the explanation for why these other things come into existence. But if you don't have anything, on your view, on this powers view, if there's nothing there, then you're not going to get something. You're not going to get a universe that is 13.7 billion years old, or however old it actually is. So I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, and good clarification there at the beginning too.
Yeah,
I'll start from the second.
Right there, they're confusing two different things. One is on terms of the ontology, which is what do we mean by a causal principle? I do not mean it as some sort of magic. Well, it's weird that Lok then says it could be an abstract principle, but how could it apply in the world if it was an abstract principle? It describes the behavior of concrete entities. Is basically his position. That's my position as well. In fact, that's what I specifically argue. That I say the causal principles derive from the concrete reality, the physics, the ordered space-time that exists, is what dictates what we observe and call the causal principle. It is not some magical separate thing that can exist apart from the concrete entities, which is why when those concrete entities don't exist, neither does the causal principle, right? So when he says that all things that begin to exist must have a cause, he's describing the state of things that exist now. But of course, before they existed, that won't have been the state of things, and therefore that premise won't apply. Right. So like that's what we're talking about here. And so to get off on this whole confusion doesn't make any sense for them. And they never got this. Lok never responded to this. I'm very clear on it. I go into, he even quotes like before where I get into the whole bit about this. He just skips right over it. Even here, he skipped right over it. But here they start to get in on a different argument, which is, and they don't articulate it very well in this clip. Maybe they get into it more in the rest of the video because I didn't see the whole thing, which is a similar thing that's been voiced by others, Alvaro and Koons and so on, which is this idea that if there was nothing, then there can't have been any potential either, right? So it would just stay nothing. But that's exactly the principle that is in question, right? Like you have to prove that. You want to prove that nothing will always stay nothing. Well, now you're describing a physical law that somehow restricts that nothing to keep it nothing. Right. And you're saying, well, but there's nothing there to cause anything. It's like, that's the point, is that we're saying when you don't need a cause, when the rules that require, when the concrete entities don't exist that manifest causation, then it is no longer the case that nothing will not cause anything. Right. Like that idea that you need a cause, they're like confusing themselves. They're walking in a circle. And so we're saying like, well, what if there's a time when there aren't necessary causes? Let's suppose there's all the concrete entities that make causation necessary are gone. Well, then you can't say that nothing will stay nothing, right? Like there's nothing around to stop it from becoming something else. And I think their idea, when they mention the idea like, well, if there's nothing, then there's no potentials, is when they get into what I talk about, which again, Lok completely ignores all the time, even though I referenced it multiple times, is that it is logically contradictory to propose that there was a state in which no actual things exist and no potential things exist, because to have no actual things entails the potential thing. Like once you take the actual away, you bring back potentials. And I give an example. I have one. This quote in one of my things. about rooms. Let me see if I have that in here. Let's see. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah. So here's an example. Now this is out of context, so don't ding me on skipping context. You can look at it's in my Kuhn's. This is in my Kuhn's cosmology versus the problem with nothing, which I can't remember if I put that in the. It might not be in the links, but it will be linked in one of the other links. But you can find it on my web. But for example, I can potentially move in every direction, but for the walls of my room preventing me, and the structure of space-time limiting the number of spatial directions I can move in to only 3. But remove those walls and that structure, and those limits vanish as well. I then increase in potential directions I can move in, not the other way around. Since you cannot have a state of no actual things and no potential things, that's logically impossible. You can only have 2 reductive states to choose from, apart from the middle state of mixture of both. But the 2 extreme states are a state of no actual things, but therefore all potential things. In other words, the removal of all limits entails the availability of all possibilities. Or a state of no potential things, but therefore all actual things, all the things needed to prevent those potentials from being realizable. Now, which of those 2 states actually consists of nothing? Obviously, only the former, right? So the absence of all limits on what can happen entails the presence of all possibilities. So anyway, the latter is the exact opposite of nothing. So when you have all actual things that prevent all potential things, but that's not nothing, right? So they're confusing this idea that if there's nothing, then there can be both no actual things, the definition of nothing, and no potential things. But that's logically impossible. Once you remove all limits to what can exist, all possibilities become probable again. And there's nothing constraining what can happen. You've just eliminated all constraints. And that's what they're not getting, and that's what they're blowing right past and ignoring, as if I never argued this. I've argued it in detail against multiple opponents. Loke knows this, so just ignore it and just repeat the argument that I've already refuted as if I never said anything. And that makes saying things pointless, right? Why do I even bother?
It definitely makes the conversation difficult and pointless to have.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that was it for his issue with nothing, because it seems like exactly what you said.
Yeah.
Like they're totally in a logically contradictory sort of understanding.
Yeah, and I'll point out that, and I've pointed this out multiple times already, is that if they could produce a logical proof, like Fermat's last theorem or something, if they could deductively prove that nothing logically necessarily entails the production of nothing, that it will always stay nothing, that somehow it's logically necessary outcome, that would eliminate at least that version of my argument. That you would still have the Lincoln-Wasser model, where you get one tick above nothing, where you have just the hairest breadths of something causes the rest of things. But no one's done that either, and Loke admits he's never done that. No one's proved that nothing must remain nothing. Like that's just a thing they keep asserting over and over again, and they keep talking about things like, well, if there's nothing to cause anything, why would anything happen? And you notice their circular argument. They're just assuming that you need a cause for something to happen in order to prove that you need a cause for something to happen, right? So they don't understand that they're contradicting themselves when they're analyzing nothing by simply assuming the very premise that we're questioning, right? It's like you can't defeat an argument that way. It's just called gainsaying. It's like that Monty Python argument. An argument is not gainsaying, the simple gainsaying of what someone said. An argument is a series of propositions that leads to a conclusion, right? Like this. This is what I'm getting. This is why it's frustrating. This is why I'm done with this, and why I'm drinking right now.
I totally understand that. Just to remind everybody that if you want to ask any questions about anything that we're talking about tonight, please send a super chat. We've already got one super chat to address. So if you can, send in a super chat, ask a question. Yeah. I mean, this is Carrier's last foray into the Kalam cosmological argument, because he's beating it with a dead horse at this point.
Yeah.
All right. So this next part is where they explain how you apparently don't understand contingency. And so Cameron's got a question about contingency, and apparently even Cameron doesn't understand contingency.
Okay, let's hear it.
Only Loke understands contingency.
All right. It's going to be a struggle.
Can I ask you a clarification?
Oh, sorry. What was that?
It's just going to be a struggle, as I said, but roll it.
Okay.
A clarifying question, because that would seem to me like it would imply that he thinks that the causal principle is a contingent principle, that it's a principle that only holds, at certain times in the universe, and it's not a metaphysically necessary principle. And from what I understand, I mean, obviously I'm not an expert in this, but it seems to me like most philosophers that argue in defense of a causal principle are defending something that they take to be metaphysically necessary, as opposed to, say, contingently true at certain times in the universe, and then false at other times.
This is a very good question, and I will answer this question actually later on when we go through the discussion on contingency and necessity, because I think there are some confusions here. In fact, Carrier also makes some confusions regarding these issues. Yeah, so I will answer your question later on as we go along. Okay.
Yeah, so we're about to get into him directly answering Cameron here in a second, but I mean, I feel like saying that the causal principle is contingent upon like the being beyond the nothing state that you describe. I feel like that would be an accurate representation of what you were trying to say, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if their position, and they're right in the sense that theists want the causal principle to be metaphysically necessary. They want that to be the case. What I'm pointing out is they have no argument that it is the case, right? And no one has produced one. Like, there's never been an argument that proves that this is logically necessarily the case. Loke claims to do it with this stupid argument that's complete bollocks. It doesn't work, right? It fails. And that's an example of the failure, which illustrates the fact that there is no argument for this, because if there was one, Loke would have used it, right? Instead, he had to resort to this bullshit about magnetic fields changing randomly and universes colliding into ours and stuff. That's all bullshit. So there's clearly no actual demonstration that the principle is metaphysically necessary. So yeah, I agree that theists want that to be the case, but that's my point, and my argument against them is they've never shown this to be the case. And we should roll with what we've got and not pretend things have happened that haven't happened, like this being proved necessary. It hasn't been. And that's the problem.
So yeah, so Cameron makes a pretty big distinction between logical necessity and metaphysical necessity. Is there a difference between the two?
So it's a debate in the field. I do not believe so. And now this is Kripke and a variety of other philosophers have argued for this third category of possibility and possibility called metaphysical impossibility. I think they all reduce to either logical or physical possibility. I don't think there is a third one. But it doesn't matter because it's semantics. Whatever you're going to call it, you still have to prove it. Right. So either you can prove it logically, so you can prove it logically necessary, or somehow you can prove that it is physically necessary, but necessary in all possible worlds. Now, how is that not logically necessary? That's the question, the debate. Like, how can you have a middle category? It's either one or the other, or whatever. But they still have to prove that it's necessary, physically necessary in all possible worlds. Otherwise, by definition, it is not. Right. And so if it is not, then that means there could have been a state of affairs that wasn't governed by it. And therefore, we're back to where we started, right, in the beginning. So they still have to prove, like, they can't just invent metaphysical necessity. They have to prove, like, explain what they mean. Like, what do I mean by metaphysically necessary? And then prove it, right? And it does have to mean, for that to work here, it does have to mean true in all possible conditions, because otherwise it is false in some conditions. And if it's false in some conditions, the premise is false, right? Because it says everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Well, if there are any conditions in which that is not true, then the statement is untrue. You can fix it by adding the qualifications, like except ... right? Put a footnote or whatever. But then the argument goes out the window. It just collapses, right? Because that exposes everything wrong with the Kalam Cosmological argument. So they still, if they want to claim that there are no possible, no thinkable, no conceivable, no realizable conditions in which the premise would be false, they have to prove that. And it doesn't matter whether they call it logical or metaphysical necessity. They still have to prove it. And my whole argument is they have not done that. It's never happened. No one's ever presented this argument, ever. And so we need to stop pretending that it's been done. It hasn't.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Because I found that them trying to distinguish between metaphysical and logical to be rather confusing. Like I wasn't exactly sure. Yeah, I wasn't exactly sure what the difference was. So I'm glad you cleared that up.
Yeah, people are interested in that. I don't know if there's a Wikipedia page on it. There certainly should be at either the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Those are two online peer-reviewed philosophy references. If you don't find metaphysical necessity as a listed category, look up Kripke. That's Kripke, because he's the proponent of this. So if you find an entry on Kripke, you'll almost certainly find a section on metaphysical necessity, and then that might link to other articles that'll get you clued in on what the position actually is. Although it is very confusing, even coming from someone who's as sharp as Kripke. Loke is a terrible explainer of things. I'm glad he's not the one who invented the principle. But I disagree even with Kripke, and I have reasons for disagreeing. But it's more of a semantic debate than anything substantial.
Okay. Well, now Loke is going to get into explaining what contingency is and how you're misunderstanding it.
Okay, so Carrier says here that one might try to argue that it is logically impossible for the causal principle not to hold, but Locke rejected that approach, admitting that it is not a logically necessary principle. Yes, I am not claiming that the causal principle is a logically necessary principle. And then he then goes on to draw the conclusion that since it is not logically necessary, it is therefore contingent. It therefore needs a cause. Now, I think there is another error here. Why? Because contingency doesn't mean that it needs a cause. Rather, contingent just means that it is true by virtue of the way things in fact are, and not by logical.
Pause right now. That is literally what how he defined causation like 5 minutes ago. There is a concrete state of affairs that results in a particular outcome. That's literally what he just fucking said. Okay, okay. Let's keep going. Yeah, I agree. By the way, like, yes, that is what contingent means. Contingent means that it is contingent on the existence of other things, which means that when those things don't exist, neither does the contingent thing. And if the contingent thing, if the things that result in the thing existing were necessary things, and it necessarily followed from those things, then it too would be logically necessary, right? So if it was logically necessary that those conditions existed, then it would be. So that's the thing where you get to this problem where he says there's got to be concrete conditions that result in these causal laws, or whatever he wants to call them, causal ishness, doesn't matter. But then are you claiming that those concrete conditions are logically necessary? And if so, that means, well, we don't need God, right? The things just exist and we've solved the problem. There's nothing else to do, right? The concrete reality exists and it behaves the way that we describe it. That's it. We're done. There's no further explanation. But if he's saying that there has to be a cause of those contingent things that result in manifesting the cause, a thing that we describe as causes, well, then he's admitting that there is a condition in which those concrete things don't exist, and therefore the causal results that we describe as causal principle or whatever won't exist there, right? That's what contingency means. They're contingent on things existing. So this really gets him into this trap between what is it that he's claiming? Like, what is he claiming is logically necessary, metaphysically necessary? What does he mean by not contingent? If it's contingent on the concrete realities, as he just said it is, then how is it not contingent? Anyway, that's my observation so far, but let's see him continue.
Okay.
It's true by virtue of the fact that, as I say, in our actual world, things happen one way rather than the other as the result of concrete entities and their properties. This is by virtue of the way things are. No, this is talking about metaphysical grounding. It's not talking about causation, right? So there is a difference between metaphysical ground. There's a distinction, right, between metaphysical grounding and causation. And so I'm claiming that the causal principle is metaphysically grounded in the way things are rather than caused to exist.
Pause.
Yeah. So Carrier is making a mistake here, right?
Pause. Yeah. No, I did not say any of this, right? So he's actually describing what I said, which is that causation is grounded in metaphysical realities. So when those metaphysical realities don't exist, neither does causation, right? Mm-hmm. That's my whole argument. And now he's just agreed with me that the causation is a product metaphysically grounded in these causal realities, these concrete realities. Okay, so how do we get to it? Like, that's the thing, is like, is he saying that those concrete realities are logically necessary? And if he is, then he's eliminating God as a necessary explanation. We don't need God anymore. The universe is the way it is because it's logically necessary. It's just, that's it. Like, it's logically necessary that concrete entities exist that would manifest as what we call causation. But that can't be what he means, right? It can't be. So he's saying that those concrete realities did not exist at some point. That's the whole point of begin to exist, that there was a point when they didn't exist and then they existed. But when they didn't exist, they can't have manifested what he's calling a causal principle, right? And I feel like, I know I'm repeating myself over and over again. It's just, I don't know how else to articulate this. I've tried every possible wording.
Yeah, but maybe they'll do something else and further clarify. But I feel like after watching this several times, what they're trying to say is that they presume that God is the one fixed concrete thing that has always existed, and because God has always existed, this a concrete thing has existed. Therefore, the causal principle has always existed, with the exception of for God. And so therefore there's never been a time whatsoever where the causal principle wasn't applied to reality.
Right. Which is a different argument, right? So that is an argument. So there is a version of theology that holds that there are no laws of physics. There's just God's will, right? So the strength of the magnetic field just is what it is because God decides it, right? There's no underlying physical reality that dictates it. It's just God wills it. And there's no laws of physics. That just what we call laws of causality is just God deciding that when one pool ball hits another in a certain way, it knocks the other pool ball out a certain way. God just decides it every time. Every time there's anything that we call a cause, God gets in and says, "Oh, I decide this," and it's all that. There's no underlying physics to any physics, which is radically anti-scientific, because the one thing that science has shown is that it's the other way around. Is that everything that we describe as causal laws is actually physically grounded in more fundamental realities below that. And a classic example is inverse square laws. Why does force projection obey inverse square laws? And it's because of the geometry of space-time. As you take energy and randomly scatter it in a sphere, it actually obeys geometrically the inverse square. It follows from the geometry of space-time, right? So this is an example of how there is a fundamental physical reality that makes things are the way they are. Same with causation. I talk about this particularly with the laws of thermodynamics in my article on all laws of thermodynamics are inevitable. You can find that on my thing where I show how it falls out. The laws of thermodynamics fall out of any random system. Actually, they emerge from any random system of large enough scale. So the causal laws are grounded, and any scientist would tell you that what we call causality is grounded in physical realities, such that if you took those realities away, then that principle wouldn't apply. The things wouldn't obey that way anymore. So if their argument was that there is no physical grounding to any of the laws of physics, well, then they need to make that argument. Now, they would get trashed by any scientist who knows anything about physics, theoretical physics. But they would have to actually make that argument. So that isn't the argument Loke has ever made. He didn't make it in his debate with me. He didn't make it in any of the articles that I read. So that isn't their argument. Now, maybe they want to skip to that argument, change to that argument, maybe they'll move the goalposts or whatever. But that would be a different argument, and we would respond to it in a different way. But my position is, what we describe as causality is the result of concrete realities, that not God, concrete realities, as in physics, physical realities, geometry, the properties of space-time. That's what I'm talking about. Now, like they can try and get rid of that with their specious metaphysics of God willing everything or whatever. But now they're no longer talking about science. They're just making shit up for which they have no evidence. And now they can't defend their premise, because their premise is based on a complete bullshit hypothesis they just pulled out of their ass that has no basis in physics, right? Like, if that's where they want to go, the Kalam Cosmological argument is fucked, right? Like, that, you're done. So I hope that's not what they want to do, but maybe they are going there. I don't know. I didn't watch the rest of the video, so I can't say.
Well, so I know that later on Cameron says that it's much easier for him to grasp the concept of all of reality being based in God's nature or God's will. The reasons why Earth exists is because of God's will and all that kind of stuff. So he doesn't go into the minute interactions in reality, but he does say that, this reality is dependent upon God's nature and will.
Yeah. So if that's that grounding theory, like if God went out for a smoke and forgot to stopped thinking about the world, and then the Earth just fell apart. Like all the atomic bonds would stop working, and it would just dissolve. And then he comes back and says, "Oh shit! I shouldn't have forgotten to keep the world together." That's just bullshit. Like that's total pseudoscience. That's medievalist claptrap, right? Physicists would like go ape over this a nonsensical argument. No, they have scientists have much better explanations for why the Earth holds together. It doesn't require some entity to constantly be thinking about every atomic bond to make it happen. No, that's not what scientists are looking for. There's no precedent for looking for this as the underlying cause of everything. So maybe Cameron thinks that. Maybe he's a fan of this whole God holds everything together by his intense thought all the time, and there is no underlying physics. But that's just someone who doesn't know physics. And Loke has not made that argument, and he didn't make it in any of our exchanges. So that's why I never responded to it in any of my articles. But I have heard it. I've heard others make this argument. It's not unknown.
Yeah, so Loke doesn't disagree with Cameron on it when he brings it up, but he also doesn't really interact with Cameron on it.
Yeah.
So Loke is trying to pretty much just stick with trying to prove the Kalam Cosmological and not really bringing up any of these other type of ideas. So I guess that's one point to Loke. We do have a little bit more on this section right here, though.
He's assuming that if the causation would have to be caused.
Yeah, I think one way to help clarify the situation here is that when people talk about like this or that is impossible or necessary or whatever, I think it's important to disambiguate what one means by necessary, because there's different senses in which something can be necessary. So something can be say logically necessary, whereas you think that like, it's logically necessary that all bachelors are married. Okay. And that's because just from understanding what those words mean, it's necessary that that sentence is true, like in every possible world. But that's sort of like a logically necessary truth. Whereas there are other things that you might just think are metaphysically necessary. So not necessarily necessary in virtue of the terms being used, but in virtue of just the way that things could possibly have been. Well, at least Dr. Craig argues that an infinite number of things can't exist in actuality. What that would be is an example of something that is metaphysically necessary, that truth, but it doesn't follow like once you understand what the term like actual world means and infinite means, it's not that like that sentence just becomes automatically true in virtue of understanding what the term infinite means and what the term actual world means. It's in virtue of thinking about that sentence together. Could it even possibly be the case in the actual world that there could be an infinite number of things existing? The basic point, though, is that when someone uses the term necessary, I think you've got to specify what you mean. Like, what sort of restriction are you talking about? Are you talking about like restricting it to something that is logically necessary in terms of like syntax and words and logistic like that? Are you talking about it in that sense, or are you talking about it in a sort of more narrow sense, in something that could actually be the case? So what he might be saying, what you were agreeing with, is that if you think about what the causal principle, like if you just spell that out, everything that begins to exist has a cause. That is not true in virtue of just like knowing what the words mean. But you might think that that's metaphysically necessarily true in virtue of reflecting on what would be the case if it were false. Or could this even be, could this possibly be false in the actual world? Which I think is different from thinking that it's like logically necessary true in virtue of just understanding what the words mean, So hopefully that was somewhat helpful for you guys, the audience. But the basic takeaway is just like, you've got to specify what you mean when you say the term necessary, because it could be necessary in one sense and then contingent in another sense, but it depends on what what sort of restriction you're putting on that term there.
It kind of makes it, at least Cameron makes it seem like you haven't defined what you're talking about. But at the very beginning of the stream, he says, I've purposefully not read like any of this interaction or any of Carrier's stuff. I am new to this. And
so he's confusing two different things. So mere semantics. So he's saying like by the properties of words, certain words result. That's actually outside philosophy, other than semantics as a field of philosophy. When philosophers, and this is so universally known, I can't imagine Loke would disagree with it, or at least if he does, he doesn't know philosophy very well. In philosophy, logical necessity means true in all possible worlds, right? So now you can demonstrate this through semantics, through deductive syllogisms. But the point ontologically about logical necessity is that there's no possible world in which it is not true. And this is obvious in the ontological argument for God, right? When they say God is logically necessary, their whole point is that there's no possible state of things, there's no universe that you could conceive of that wouldn't have a God in it, or wouldn't have God in it, or wouldn't have the God, the creator of it. That's the ontological argument, is the point. God is true in all possible worlds. That's the point of it. That's what we mean by logical necessity. This is universal in philosophy. Now, the analytical philosophers, the positivists, back in the days of A.J. Ayer, they would focus on the semantics because they thought metaphysics didn't exist. But that's been changed since then. We don't follow that. And that's because they folded everything that we would call metaphysics into physics. And a lot of what we call metaphysics would just be hypothetical physics or fictional physics. Anyway, there's a lot of semantics going on with the logical positivists back in the early 20th century. That's all in the past. Philosophers now, when they say logically necessary truth, they mean true in all possible worlds. Full stop. Because if it is true in any possible world, it necessarily is going to be true semantically, right? Like so you can't get a semantic contradiction, but also have the physical possibility. So they're actually one and the same. And when Kripke developed this third category of metaphysical possibility or impossibility, he wasn't doing what William Lane Craig does. In fact, William Lane Craig is a con artist. He's a bullshit artist. This whole thing about infinities is bullshit. No real philosopher has ever made this argument. No one has said that actual infinities are metaphysically impossible. That is a completely made up bullshit thing. It's just William Lane Craig and all of his acolytes. It just comes from him and people who repeat him. That is not in philosophy. That's not in mathematics. It's nowhere. And that is not what Kripke meant. Kripke would be turning in his fucking grave if he knew that Craig was using his concept for that particular argument. It's bullshit. The actual fact is that if actual infinities are logically possible, which they are, then you can do a one-to-one set correspondence to physical realities. And so you logically necessarily can have an actual infinity actualized. Now, Craig does a song and dance, top hat, and a bunch of bullshit to try and make it sound like, but it's impossible. But he never actually demonstrates that it's impossible. And literally every living mathematician who knows transfinite mathematics is rolling their eyes at his bullshit. It is bullshit, and this 100% bullshit. And I'm tired of arguing this because this comes up in the Kalam Cosmological argument a lot. And I literally just keep increasing the list of fucking mathematicians that I list. Look, read this, fucking read this, fucking everything, standard references in the field, like everything. And just, they keep repeating this bullshit. And it's like, no, every mathematician disagrees with you. It is not true. There is no concept of impossibility about infinities. Actual infinities are not impossible in any sense whatsoever. But Craig is bullshitting. Like that is not part of the field of metaphysical impossibility in the philosophical field where like Kripke and others have argued. It's nothing to do with that. It's just made up. Something William Lane Craig made up because William Lane Craig is a con artist. And Cameron obviously is a sucker, complete, mark, buying into this bullshit and is not reading the mathematicians explaining over and over again that this is bullshit. And the videos that the Skydive Phil videos that you link to, they have all these experts, mathematicians, philosophers, and scientists explaining this. They have whole sections, I think, in both videos on this infinity argument and why it's complete bullshit. So that's a bad example of metaphysical impossibility because it's a bullshit example. It doesn't exist. It's fake. It's made up. And Cameron doesn't know that. Like, he's fallen for this. So I don't know what to do with that. Like, I can't, like, if he'd given a good example, which is more complicated, then I could deal with it. But it doesn't matter because you still have to prove that it's metaphysically impossible. Whatever you think you mean by that, you have to explain, like you said, you have to explain what you mean by that. But when philosophers say logically impossible, they mean impossible in all possible worlds, right? Or if they say something's logically possible, they mean there is a possible world that could be constructed in which it would not be true. And then the opposite of that is contingent. If it is not logically necessary, then it is contingent. There's proper dichotomy between those two things. There's no third thing, right? So like if there is a possible world that can be realized in which the thing doesn't exist, and that thing is contingent, and it is contingent on whatever is different between that world and the worlds in which it is true, right? So, and it's contingent on whatever physical, foundation makes it true in one world and not true in the other world. So that's how you actually do all of this. I don't think it really matters. I think this is a sideshow that doesn't really get us any further on the Kalam argument or understanding it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree about that. So let's see. There's a couple minutes left. I can't remember what Loke comes back with, but
Let's listen.
let's see if he had. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. There's a distinction between logical necessity and metaphysical necessity. Although there are some philosophers who have disputed this distinction as well. But in any case, my argument does not depend on this distinction actually. Because I'm saying that, yeah, I mean, even if you can have logically possible worlds, they are totally chaotic. So, I mean, we can imagine a world that there are tigers begin uncross around us all the time, right? This we can conceive of such a world. But obviously, this is not our actual world, right? Our actual world is not like that. And as I explained in my publications, the proponent of the Kalam argument only needs to defend the claim that the causal principle is true in the actual world, right? To show that in the actual world, there is a creator. The proponent doesn't have
pause. This is not true, right? Merely showing the causal notice he said causal principle again, even though he hates the word principle and disavowed it. Now he's back. So he says if the causal principle is true in this world, that's all he's arguing. It's like, no, that Kalam argument argues that even before this world existed, the causal principle applied, right? That's the whole point of the Kalam cosmological argument. So he's just tanking his whole argument. And he just admitted that it is logically possible and metaphysically possible, even if you want to make that distinction, that there are worlds. He mentioned a chaos world. There could be a chaos world that's not governed by the causal principle, and it would just be a chaos world. And we wouldn't live there, which is true. Like chaos world could never produce organisms. There's a whole issue about Boltzmann brains, so I won't get into that. If people are interested in that, I can look it up on my blog. But generally, it's not going to produce observers. So obviously, that's not why we're not in one of those worlds. Now, imagine a chaos world, just like he described. He said it's logically possible. He admitted it. There could be a chaos world. It could be somewhere. Let's say it's 50 billion years before the Big Bang. There was a chaos world. Or even right before 2 seconds before the Big Bang, there was a chaos world where there's no causal principle and it's just everything's random and it just doesn't follow any rules or anything. Okay. Well, now there's a calculable probability that this chaos world will Big Bang. It will create a Big Bang in which there is an ordered world. This is actually, we can do the math. Sean Carroll has done it in a paper. I cite this paper a lot because it's fun to note that we have a calculable probability that that my fingernail could turn into a Big Bang right now. The probability is so small, you don't need to worry about it. But it's a non-zero probability, and it is a calculable probability, right? So let's say you have this chaos world, and it's just chaos for billions and trillions of gazillions of years. Well, basic rule of probability, if any non-zero probability, no matter how small, approaches 100% as time approaches infinity. So given an amount of time, just let it run, let this chaos world run long enough, eventually, as a logically necessary truth, the probability will be near, like as close to 100% as conceivable, if not 100%, that there will be a Big Bang that will create an ordered world, a bubble of an ordered world inside the chaos world. And that bubble world, we would not see the chaos world because we would be outside of it, right? We'd be created and fly away from it. And so we would have this own causal world. And it's a logically necessary outcome of the chaos world that Andrew Loke just admitted could exist. So now, why do we need God? We could just say, oh, it's just a chaos world. What if there was a chaos world? You know, the outcome is inevitable, right? Like the observation we're making now is inevitable given the posit that there was once a chaos world. Now, we don't live in that chaos world. We live in a world that bubbled off of it. Yeah. And in our world, it's not a chaos world. That's why we live in it. We couldn't live in a chaos world. We wouldn't arise there. So he's just admitted that the premise is false, that there are possible worlds that this principle doesn't apply in. Just exactly what I said. And as I just pointed out, it would inevitably result in our world, the ordered non-chaos world. And that's my argument, and the argument he never addresses and never goes anywhere with. Yeah.
And the entire interview is just them totally tap dancing around your actual point. So
yeah.
don't expect anything as far as like a real response.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, there's a little bit more here. So
Okay,
let's listen to this.
Claim that the causal principle is true in all possible worlds, right? So, and therefore, Carrier's objection fails. And the next point is that he goes on to claim that if the principle is contingent, then there is logically necessary the case that there are logically possible conditions in which it will not exist and therefore does not apply. And therefore, he thinks that therefore the first premise of the Kalam is false. Now, as I said, this is a non sequitur, right? Because as I said, the first premise only states that the causal principle is true in the actual world, right? Which is compatible with it being.
That's false. His first premises does not say that, right? It says.
Yeah, he seems to be adding on an assumption there.
I know, right? I just can't freaking. And it's a contradictory assumption. It refutes the entire Kalam argument to put that assumption in there. I can't believe I have to do this. This is so unbelievable. Okay, let me find it. Nope, wrong one. All right. I just got to check this because I'm being gaslighted again.
I feel like every time I bring you on the channel, it's to make me feel gaslit.
Well, that's what Christian apologists do, like all the freaking time, and that's why. Like, if I dealt with more sane, rational people, I wouldn't have this feeling as often. I think is the reality. Okay, so here we go. I got the quote from the book. I'm sure I have it. Maybe I don't have it in my article. It's going to take me a while to find it. I'm quite positive he doesn't say all things in the universe that begin to exist have a cause, because then you couldn't get the conclusion of the Kalam, because you're not identifying the universe itself as one of those things. I can't find it, so I can't find the. I'm pretty sure that his premise does not say that, and if it does, I'm shocked that I missed it, because that was just a self-defeating premise. Like, it just destroys the whole argument if you were to reformulate it that way.
Yeah, it does not surprise me that he said something contradictory.
Yeah, false in other logically possible worlds, and therefore is compatible with Carrier's claim that there are logically possible conditions in which it will not exist and does not apply. And therefore, it doesn't follow from Carrier's claim that the first premise is false.
Yeah, totally dunked on there, Rick.
Yeah, no, that is why it is false. It doesn't say in this universe. It says all things that begin to exist have a cause. All things. And now he's admitting that that's false, that it is not true that all things that have a beginning have a cause. And he's admitting that the only things that he can say that about are things already in the universe. So he can't attribute it to the universe. So the argument's toast. Like, he literally just shat the bed on this. I just can't. I don't know. I just don't know what to do with this stuff. It's unbelievable.
Yeah,
right, is that it? Have we done them all, or do we have another one?
Well, so there was one more clip that I cut out, but it was pretty much just Cameron being confused over you saying that an infinite multiverse is statistically inevitable. And so I was just wondering if maybe you can elaborate on that, because he seemed to be very confused about.
What did Loke say? Because that's Loke. Loke agrees with me on that. Right? That it is possible for an infinite multiverse. Like, if you abandon the principle that the inevitable result would be an infinite multiverse. Like, he actually said this to me in an oral debate. So what did Loke say in response to Cameron when Cameron was saying that? Like, do you remember?
Well, from what I gathered, he just kind of chuckled along with Cameron as if that was like a ridiculous thing, as far as it, because like I said, they're stuck in this whole concrete reality kind of thing. And so
that's not informative. If Loke was just chuckling along, we don't know what he was chuckling at. And from what I understand from Loke's position, he's chuckling at not that the conclusion follows from the premise. He agrees with me on that. He's chuckling at the premise, right? He thinks, well, that if that were the case, we should see rabbits and stuff, right? The magnetic field strength should be changing randomly. He means all those. He thinks it results in all those ridiculous things, and therefore it's ridiculous of me to suggest that it was ever the case. And that's what he's laughing at. Like, but he doesn't disagree with the fact that the conclusion follows from the premise. He agrees with me on that, right? So, like, if you start with a condition where there is no causal limits on what can happen, then what will happen will be random and spontaneous. It will not be specifically caused. It'll be caused by the absence of all causes. and it'll just randomly occur, and it will be an infinite multiverse, or near enough, right? Like near enough to matter. There's a whole question in transfinite mathematics is about random number generators and infinite quantities. We haven't solved mathematically, so we can't say for sure if you picked a random number between 1 and infinity, and even though infinity is not a number on the number line, but if you pick a random number of all numbers, we don't even know how to do that. Like a computer we couldn't even program a computer to do that, because what would it be? Like what would be your, like, what is the probability of what number? Like there's any number you pick, it is infinitely more probable that you would pick a higher number. So it creates this weird problem in probability theory that we have not solved. So you could say maybe it's solved somehow, but it has to, like, if it gets picked at random, well, due to Cantor's cardinalities of infinity, there's actually an infinite number of infinities. They are different quantities. There are infinities that are larger than other infinities. And I know William Lane Craig can't get his mind around this, and I doubt Cameron or Loke could as well. But that means that if you pick a random number, like there's actually more infinities than there are numbers, so which are infinite. So you'd probably get an infinity. If you picked a number at random, it would be an infinite thing. But even if it was finite, we know that the number would be ghastly large. Like it would, because we think 10 to the power of 200, we think that's a large number. But compared to infinity, that's fucking, like, that doesn't even show up in your math, right? Like that's like almost zero, right? That is a really small number compared to the numbers that can exist. So anyway, the point being is, like, if you pick at random the number of universes that can exist, because you have no limits dictating what the number would be, then you're going to get an infinite multiverse, and they're all going to be random. They're all going to be different, selected at random. And when that's the thing. It's like, that's why you won't have, if you think of it mathematically. So imagine that you have nothing, and though no constraints on what can happen, because we've eliminated all constraints on what can happen. So it's just going to spontaneously become something randomly. And you figure it's going to randomly become a number of universes. Well, what is the probability that the number of universes would be 0, which would be nothing remaining nothing, which is the principle that they want? The probability is infinity to 1, right? Because it's 0 is just one possibility. Every non-zero number, there's an infinite number of them. So it's infinity to 0. So the probability is infinitesimal. It's so far close to 0 that it's practically 0, is the probability of nothing remaining nothing. Now, what is the probability of it being vast? A huge, huge number of universes, this arbitrarily large number of universes. Well, the same, because no matter what number of universes you pick, it's infinity to 1 that it will be big. You would pick a bigger number, right? So it's always close to 0 that it would be that many universes. It's always going to be some larger number of universes, which is why it's probably going to be infinite. But even if it's not, through some weird mathematical reason we don't understand yet, it's going to be vastly large, right? And if you have, and they're all random. So let's say you have 10 to the power of 1 billion universes. No, 10 to the power of 1 billion to the power of 1 trillion universes. And they're all randomized. What is the probability that you would have our universe? Or one similarly enough like it, that there would be observers like us having this video right now? Well, it's virtually 100%, right? Because it's the probability, no matter how low the probability is, there's going to be enough universes with random selection, enough random selections that you're always going to get a royal flush. It's like you're playing 1 billion poker games. You're going to get a royal flush out of 1 billion poker games. You're guaranteed, right? Like this, because the probability of getting no royal flushes across 1 billion games of poker is super, super low, like virtually 0. It's not 0, granted, but it's pretty close to 0. And so that's the idea. That's the principle that Loke and I are talking about. And he mentioned that with the chaos world, that if there's a chaos world, you would have, and even when Cameron talked about the chaos world, he said there would be an infinite number of things would pop out of this state. It's like, yeah, that's my point, bro. Infinite number of things. And our universe is statistically going to be one of those things. Like, it's just the odds are close to 1, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I just checked the transcript for it, and it's pretty much just Loke does explain your concept and in response to Cameron, but they basically, like, Loke doesn't push back against Cameron. He just sort of chuckles along. Yeah. He just chuckles along with him, and then they just simply state that you're making nothing into something, as if you're changing your position or trying to circumvent some kind of thing.
Yeah, which gets back to that semantic argument. Now, mind you, I explicitly acknowledge this argument about the nothing and something distinction The exact argument that you're just describing, I talk about it and address how I address it. And I've done this in every article I've written about this for like 10 years or more now. And I did it in the debate with Loke. I did it. And so they just keep ignoring. Well, I guess Cameron, we can't accuse because he says he didn't read any of it. So he's not ignoring it. He just doesn't know it. He's just gullibly trusting Loke to tell him what I've argued. Whereas Loke is literally ignoring and not telling Cameron pretty much everything I argued. And it's just, Cameron's kind of a dupe here. He's just being fooled. He's over trusting this unreliable operator to tell him what I've said. And I would say, like, as a rule, never do that. Just go read what I said. Like, never trust a Christian apologist talking about anything I've said. Never, ever, ever trust them. They might be telling the truth. Just don't trust them because the odds are against it. So you got to double check and go check before you believe them. As a rule, like literally, as just a universal rule, any Christian apologist, doesn't matter who it is, even someone I trust, like Jonathan Sheffield, I would say Jonathan Sheffield would always tell the truth about what I've said. But I would tell you not to trust him because you don't know that. Like, you know, other than the fact that I just told you that, the Jonathan Sheffield is probably pretty reliable. He's an honest guy, but he's extremely rare. Most Christian apologists will not tell the truth about what I've said. And so you should never trust them. You should always check first before trusting them.
Yeah, definitely. We do have a couple of super chats to go over. But if y'all want us to answer questions, please do. We would love to hear what y'all have to say. So, or what rather ask, about it. So our first one is from Theistic Pearls of Wisdom, who says, isn't the Kalam kind of a fallacy of composition, assuming that cause and effect as observed within the system must apply to the system itself?
Okay, yeah, I hadn't really formulated it in that sense. So for people who don't know, so the fallacy of composition is you're made of atoms, therefore you are an atom. That's the fallacy of composition, right? The thing that you're composed of is going to be a different thing than all the parts. And so the fallacy is like that. And so the idea, and in a sense, that's true. Like Loke is saying, well, all we observe is that the universe is made up of causes. Therefore, the universe itself must be caused. That's not the way he argues it. But I can see how that would be an implication, like that you could imply that from what he argues, and it is fallacious. But that isn't the way he argues it. So I wouldn't go accuse him of that fallacy. But I agree with your insight. I think that there's something to that because they're looking at everything that we see is caused, that therefore the causal entity itself is caused. And then you get this with Loke didn't do this, but others in the Kalam have done this. When they mean temporal cause, like cause before effect, and yet they try to explain that time was caused. But that's a logical contradiction, right? There can't have been anything before time to have caused time, right? So you have to get to this simultaneous causation model, and then things fall apart. And William Lane Craig gets into the weeds on this a lot about that. It's like once you have simultaneous causation, you don't need God anymore. And so right, you're just saying there was something that just existed uncaused at the first point of time. Okay, it could be freaking anything then. It doesn't have to be God. But I do think that there's something to what Theistic Pearls is talking about. That in a sense that if you're trying to map how their brain is getting from A to B, this fallacy is in there, but it isn't a part of the way they're articulating the defense of their position, if that makes sense. So I would be wary of this. I would look for it, and I think it's there cognitively, but I don't think it's there semantically, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And then the other super chat we have is, here's a few bucks from Monsterhead, who says, I enjoy listening to Kara explain things. He speaks my preferred language.
Here.
Yeah. All right. Well, so far that's all. I guess people really don't have too much of a question about the Kalam cosmological argument.
This is your chance for everyone. I'm probably not going to publicly do this again. I mean, Godless Engineer literally had to convince me to do this. I was like, I don't know, man.
Well, I really appreciate you coming by and giving us your time. We just got one
come up. Yeah, this one just
popped up. Yep. Let's see. Isn't causality itself dialectical rather than metaphysical?
Hey Mario. Yeah, he and I have talked about this a bit. He's a hardcore Marxist, metaphysical Marxist even. So this kind of conversation comes up. Yeah, how do I answer it? I would say it's physical, right? I guess in a sense you would say it's metaphysical in the way that I define metaphysics, which is how you fill the gaps in physics. So metaphysics is just an extension of physics for me. Metaphysics is more like hypothetical gap filling of physics. But once it's completed, it's just all becomes physics. So all metaphysics will eventually someday just be physics. I think it's just a description of what is. And so to the extent that it's dialectical, it gets into the weeds of what do different philosophers mean by dialectical versus metaphysical. But if we're going to say that it's something different from being physically the case, then I would disagree. I would say causality is definitely a physical property instantiated and emerging from other physical entities. The concrete, what is it? Concrete entities. Yes. There are objective concrete realities, physics, that manifest and emerge as what we call causality, I guess this way. And that's a hypothesis, but it's been proven to a very high probability empirically by science. So that's my view of that.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's see. That's it. Unless anybody has any other questions that you want to send in a super chat. This is going to be the book is shut on the Kalam Cosmological argument. Honestly, I don't think that I have any questions for you as far as the Kalam goes. I know that there was one particular instance where you said that even if you were to accept or be able to prove the first premise of the Kalam, the second one would then ultimately fail.
Although I'm not adamantly against the second premise. Now, I don't. The second premise is false as an absolute. Like it says that if you say that it necessarily is the case that the universe had a beginning, that's false. If you say contingently, it just so happens that the universe had a beginning or existence. Let's be clear. We're not talking about the universe. We're talking about all existence. So there could be a million Big Bangs before ours, but there was a first one, right? Is the idea. That's possible. I don't think that that's impossible. I think it's interesting that the models like the Lincoln-Wasser model would explain all observations from that being the case. So I think that is a physically plausible model. And there are cosmologists who've come out with completely godless explanations of everything based on that model. So it's entirely credible that there was a beginning somewhere far, far, far back. It's folly to just insist that we know this, and that's why I think it's the least interesting premise of the Kalam, because it could be true, it could be false, but the fact of it being true doesn't lead to the conclusion. It's the first premise that's really the problem with Kalam.
Okay, awesome. We did have one more come in that was just a donation of 20. So nice. Thank you so much there, Daniel. Appreciate you. And unless we've got any other comments, I think I'm gonna let you go.
All right.
Well, thank you so much, Rick, for stopping by today and discussing all of this with us.
Oh, and thanks for all the work you put into this, because you had to endure watching that video, the whole thing, and you put the clips together, well selected. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, it was incredibly difficult, like getting through, because it's an hour long, so I had to pretty much watch it like 5 times, and then each clip making sure that I got everything
that's rough,
to where
man.
It made sense.
Yeah. The things we do for love. Wow. Yeah. No, that's a lot of work. So yeah, that's why I'm definitely appreciated. It's good to be able to cap it, because everybody's going to keep like, what's your response to this video? And like, oh, all right. So now you've helped me give. I'll just say, go there. You'll not only will you understand my response to this video, you'll understand why I will not respond to any more of these videos. So I think we've done a good job of explaining all of that.
Awesome. Well, again, Rick, thank you so much for coming in tonight and explaining all this to us. And for everybody out there, please definitely visit all the links down below to Rick's blog and read all of the stuff that you want to. I've got a list of the scholarly, all the scholarly books down below, and in a list on Amazon. And so definitely visit all that. And I guess we'll just see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up, use your voice, and all that kind of good shit. Bye, heathens.